Welcome to everyone who has joined today's seminar on media profiling and polarization, which will be conducted by the media team at Verité Research. I'd like to invite the head of the media team, Deepanjali Abewardana, to welcome our participants and guest speakers to lay the foundation for the conversation that we hope to have on these two key areas when it comes to media reporting, and also to briefly outline the agenda for today's session. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. Hi, everyone. Very nice to see all of you. A lot of familiar faces. Thanks so much for joining this session today amidst your busy schedule. I will give you a very quick overview of what we will discuss. We will be focusing on two areas, as the topic suggests: media profiling and polarization. One area that often gets discussed in relation to media polarization is political polarization. That is not what we are going to focus today. Instead, we will be focusing on the other notable feature of media polarization, which is language divide. We will try to understand how media reporting in Sinhala and Tamil media may have further polarized the society we live in. As you know, ours is a country that has experienced an armed conflict for more than 2 decades and gone through communal clashes and tensions from time to time. In such a scenario, it is quite important to understand how language can exacerbate deeply divided fault lines in our society. We will be sharing examples from our platform, The Divide, to discuss language divide. The other area we will focus on is media profiling. There are again many dimensions to profiling. For instance, gender profiling is an area that Ethics Eye has been problematizing for a while. In today's session, that's not going to be the focus. Instead, we will be showing how individuals belonging to different ethno-religious identities get subject to negative profiling under negative circumstances. For that, we will be sharing findings from Ethics Eye to understand that. And to give you a very quick structure of what we are going to do today, there are 3 presenters from Verité Research: Anupama Nirandi, Rochelle Kanagasabe, and Stephanie Nicole. They will be presenting in all 3 languages, Sinhala, Tamil, and English. After the presentation, we have 2 eminent journalists with us who need no introduction, who have joined us today: Amantha Perera and Munza Mushtaq. We are privileged to have the 2 of you with us today, and thanks so much for joining. Amantha and Munza will take 10 minutes each and will share their perspectives and insights into media profiling and polarization. After the 2 guest speakers, we will have a Q&A session moderated by our Executive Director of Verité Research, Dr. Nishanti Ma'am. I will now very quickly share a few housekeeping rules that we can keep in mind. Please keep your mics off at all times until the Q&A session kicks in so that there are minimal interruptions. When it comes to the Q&A session, you can always ask your question by putting the video on and introducing yourself. If that's too much to ask, maybe you can also put your questions in the chat box. We have Amanthi with us, who will be channeling all the questions that we get to Nishan. And also, just as we do the presentation in all 3 languages during the Q&A session, please feel free to ask questions in Sinhala or Tamil or English. We will be able to take as many questions as possible from all those languages. And don't let language be a divide, be a barrier in this session. There's one other small request that we want to make. There's a small questionnaire which won't take at least 1 minute of your time to fill in. Stephanie can share more instructions as to what can be done in order to submit it in a very, in a couple of minutes. Over to you, Stephanie, to share the instructions for the questionnaire, and then we can start the session.
Thank you so much, Deepanjali. And welcome again to everyone else who has just joined in for our session today on media profiling and polarization. In the chat box, Amanthi will drop a link to a short questionnaire, as Deepanjali mentioned. This is just for us to get a sense of the areas when it comes to media reporting that you're familiar with. If you have already filled this questionnaire in the email that we would have sent it to you, thank you very much for doing so. If you are yet to fill it, you can click on the link that is in the chat box. We'd greatly appreciate it if you can take about 2 minutes to submit your responses, and then we can resume the session. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please drop a message on the chat box and Amanthi or I will be able to assist you. Thank you. Thanks very much, everyone, for filling that short questionnaire. Verité Research's media team would now like to present our findings on media profiling and polarization. For this part of the presentation, I'm joined by two of my colleagues, Anupama Nirandi and Rochelle Kanagasabe. We'd like to speak to you about media profiling and polarization into two parts. These two areas are what we refer to as problematic media content or ailments in the media. So in the first section, Nirandi will be able to speak to you about media profiling. This is where she will look at how ethnic and religious communities, how the identities of these communities tend to be reported or highlighted in news items in a manner when it is not directly relevant to the particular news story. She will also use examples from the EthicSci platform to look at how ethnic and religious minorities in particular, how the identities of these groups tend to be highlighted in negative news context. So when we look at some of these examples, we'll be able to understand this a little bit better as we look at them. And then Rochelle will speak to you about media polarization. This is to do with a language divide in Sri Lankan media, where we would be able to see how there's a divide between Sinhala language media and Tamil language media when it comes to how it reports on national level issues. And Rochelle will use examples from the divide to speak to us about this area in further detail. We'd really like to have an inclusive session, as Deepanjali mentioned earlier, and as such, Rochelle, Nirandi, and I will do our level best to summarize the content in Sinhala, Tamil, and English. I'd like to ask Nirandi to take us through the first section on media profiling. Nirandi, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. ලෝකයේ සහ ලංකාවේ පිළිගත් මාධ්‍ය ආචාර ධර්ම අතරින් විවිධ ජාතීන්ට අයත් ජන කොටස් සම්බන්ධයෙන් මාධ්‍ය වාර්තාකරණයේදී පිළිගත් ආචාර ධර්ම දෙකක් තියෙනවා. ඒ පිළිබඳව ඔබේ අවධානයට ලක් කරන්න කැමතියි. එකක් තමයි පුවතට ඍජුවම අදාළ නොවන අවස්ථාවක පුද්ගලයෙකුගේ වාර්ගිකත්වය ආගමිකත්වය පළ කිරීමෙන් වළකින්න යන්න දෙවැන්න දැන දැනම හෝ හිතාමතා ආගමික වාර්ගික ජන කොටස් අතර අසමගිය හෝ ප්‍රචණ්ඩත්වය ප්‍රවර්ධනය කිරීමෙන් වළකින්න යන්න. ඊට ආචාර ධර්ම දෙක පිළිබඳව අප සොයා බැලීමක් සිදු කළා. එතික්සයි පර්යන්තය හරහා. එතික්සයි ප්ලැට්ෆෝම් එහෙමත් නැත්නම් පරීක්ෂණ පර්යන්තය කියන්නේ මොකක්ද කියලා මම ඔබට පැහැදිලි කරන්නම්. ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ මාධ්‍ය විසින් කරනු ලබන මාධ්‍ය ආචාර ධර්ම උල්ලංඝනයන් නිරීක්ෂණය කරන ඒ පිළිබඳව පොදුවේ සමාජය දැනුවත් කරන පරීක්ෂණාත්මක පර්යන්තයක්. එහෙමත් නැත්නම් ප්ලැට්ෆෝම් එකක්. අපගේ Facebook, Twitter ගිණුම් වලට ගියොත් ඔබට මේ පිළිබඳව වැඩි විස්තර දැනගන්න පුළුවන්. මම ආරාධනා කරනවා පැමිණෙන්න අපේ පිටුවට. එහි ඔබගේ අදහස් යෝජනා දක්වන්න. හොඳයි. මම යන්නම් අපගේ පරීක්ෂණ දත්ත වෙතට. මේ ග්‍රැෆික් සටහනින් පෙන්වන්නේ අපි පළමුවෙනියට කියපු පුවතට අදාළ නොවන අවස්ථාවකදී වාර්ගිකත්වය සඳහන් කළ අවස්ථා. මේ විශේෂත්වය වන්නේ එම පුවත් තුළ වාර්ගිකත්වය බහුතරයක්ම ඍණාත්මක සන්දර්භයකදී ඉස්මතු වී තිබීම. ඔබට පෙනෙනවා එවැනි වාර්ගික ඉස්මතු කිරීම ඇතැම් පුවත්පත් වැඩි වාර ගණනකුත් ඇතැම් පුවත්පත් අඩු වාර ගණනකුත් සිදු කර තිබෙනවා. ඒ වගේම අපි 2016 සිට මෙම දත්ත පිළිබඳව සොයා බැලීමක් සිදු කරලා තියෙනවා. ඒ අනුව මෙය හැම වර්ෂයකම සිදුවෙන බව දකින්න ලැබුණා. අපේ පිටුවට ගියොත් මේ පිළිබඳව වැඩි වශයෙන් අධ්‍යයනය කරන්න පුළුවන්. මම කැමති උදාහරණ කිහිපයකින් වැඩිදුර පැහැදිලි කිරීමක් කරන්න. මත්ද්‍රව්‍ය සමග අත්අඩංගුවට ගත් සිදුවීමක් ඔබට පෙනෙනවා ඇති. එකම පුවත්පත් දෙකකින් වාර්තා කරලා තියෙනවා. එක් පුවතක් වාර්ගිකත්වය ඉස්මතු කරලා තියෙනවා සිරස්තලය තුලත් අන්තර්ගතය තුලත් අනෙක් පුවතේ එසේ සිදු කළා නැහැ. එතකොට ඔබට පෙනෙනවා ඇති වාර්ගිකත්වයේ සඳහන් නොකළ පුවතේ අර්ථයට කිසිදු හානියක් සිදු වී නොමැති බව. ඒ අනුව බැලුවම මම ඔබෙන් අහන්න කැමති මත්ද්‍රව්‍ය බෙදීම සහ ජනවාර්ගිකත්වය අතර සම්බන්ධයක් තියෙනවද? ඇයි වාර්ගිකත්වය ඉස්මතු කරන්නේ? අනිත් උදාහරණයට ගියොත් පොලිස් නිලධාරියෙක් මත්ද්‍රව්‍ය සමගින් අත්අඩංගුවට ගත්ත පුවතක් එහි අදාළ පොලිස් නිලධාරියාගේ වාර්ගිකත්වය සඳහන් කරලා නැහැ. ඒත් සෙසු අයගේ වාර්ගිකත්වය සඳහන් කරලා තියෙනවා. මම අහන්න කැමති මේ මත්කුඩු ප්‍රවාහනයේට වැරදිකරු වූ රජයේ සේවකයාගේ වාර්ගිකත්වයේ පුවත් පළ නොකළේ ඇයි කියන එක. සහ ඔහු සමග අත්අඩංගුවට ගත් අනෙකුත් සැකකරුවන් දෙදෙනාගේ වාර්ගිකත්වය පමණක් පළ කළේ ඇයි කියන එකයි. ඒ වගේම මේ එකම පුවත පුවත්පත් 3කින් පළ කරලා තියෙන ආකාරය ඔබට පෙනෙනවා ඇති. එහිදී පුවත්පත් දෙකක වාර්ගිකත්වය සඳහන් කරලා තියෙනවා. අනෙක් පුවත්පතෙහි වාර්ගිකත්වය සඳහන් කිරීමක් සිදු වෙලා නැහැ. ඒ වගේම වාර්ගිකත්වය සඳහන් නොකළ පුවතේ අර්ථයට කිසිදු හානියක් සිදු වී නැති බව ඔබට පෙනේවි. මේ නිසා මම කැමතියි කියන්න වාර්ගිකත්වය මෙම පුවත්පතට අදාළ නොවන බව. ඉංග්‍රීසි දමිළ මාධ්‍යයෙන් ඔබට මේ පිළිබඳව වැඩි පැහැදිලි කිරීමක් ගෙනේවි ස්ටෙෆනි රොෂෙල් විසින්.
Thank you, Nirandi. So Nirandi spoke about 2 ethical guidelines that are recommended globally and locally for media personnel to use. And these guidelines are relevant to how ethnic and religious groups are reported in the media when they're not directly relevant to the story. So the first guideline, if I were to mention that, is on religion and religion when it is not directly relevant to the story. The second ethical guideline that she mentioned is to not knowingly or willingly promote communal discord or violence. So when she focused on the first ethical guideline, she was able to look at how EthicSci has been monitoring the media's adherence to this guideline. One of the exercises carried out by EthicSci year after year is to check which media outlets tend to follow this guideline or violate this guideline. And from the infographic that she showed us, we were able to see the most recent numbers for those that did not follow this particular guideline. And the fact that EthicSci has managed to look at this on a yearly basis is able to show us that it's a recurrent issue that the media tends to highlight ethnic and religious identities when it is not relevant to the story. And therefore, this persistent issue is one that we should discuss as we are doing today. And later on in the session, we can speak about how to address it as well. So I'd also like to speak about the 2 examples that Nirandi mentioned. Perhaps focus on this example that you can see on your screen. So while both examples were drug-related offenses, in this particular example, there are 3 individuals. Now, from the 3 individuals, one is a police officer, and the other 2 are also suspects who are involved in this particular incident. However, what you can see on the left-hand side of your screen is that the ethnicity of 2 of the suspects is highlighted as them being from the Tamil ethnic group, whereas the ethnic identity of that police officer is not mentioned in this story. And then if you look at the example on the right-hand side, the same story has been reported. However, in this case, while the core details have been maintained, the ethnic and religious identities of these individuals have not been mentioned. So the question that Nirandi was able to ask us is whether ethnicity was really relevant to the news item, especially as there was a way to have reported on it without having featured these ethnic or religious identities. And then, as we will see with further examples that Nirandi is able to show us, generally, when we see ethnic and religious minority identities being reported, they're done so in a negative context. As you can see in this example as well, it's to do with a criminal offense. The more and more that we tend to see the media associating ethnic minorities or religious minorities with negative news, it can allow for a profiling of these individuals in the media. So I'd like to pause there and I'd like to ask Rochelle to perhaps translate or summarize this section in Tamil, and then we can look at some further examples as we go ahead. Rochelle, over to you.
Thank you, Stephanie. நிரந்தி கூறியதை நான் சுருக்கமாக தமிழில் கூறினால் அவர் மீடியா ப்ரொஃபைலிங் அல்லது ஊடக விபரக்குறிப்புகள் பற்றி விளக்கி கூறினார். இதற்கு பொருத்தமான 2 உலகளவில் ஏற்றுக்கொள்ளப்பட்ட ஊடக வழிகாட்டுதல்களை குறிப்பிட்டிருந்தார். முதலாவது, செய்திக்கு ஒரு நபரின் இனம் மற்றும் மதம் நேரடியாக தொடர்பற்றதாயின் அதை வெளியிடுவதை தவிர்ப்பதாகும். 2வது, தெரிந்து கொண்டு வகுப்புவாத முரண்பாடு அல்லது வன்முறையை ஊக்குவிப்பதை தவிர்ப்பதாகும். எத்திக்ஸாயினால் வெளியிடப்பட்ட சில உதாரணங்கள் மூலம் அவர் எங்களுக்கு மேலும் இந்த ஊடக வழிகாட்டுதல்களை விளக்கி கூறியிருந்தார். எங்களுக்கு ஒரு இன்ஃபோகிராஃபிக் மூலம் இவர் இது ஒரு தொடர்ச்சியான மற்றும் தீவிரமான பிரச்சனையாக காட்டினார். பின்னர் அவர் 2 உதாரணங்களை முன்வைத்தார். அவரின் முதல் உதாரணம், ஒரு நபர் போதைப் பொருளுடன் கைது செய்யப்பட்ட போது ஒரு பத்திரிகை சந்தேக நபரின் இனத்தை முஸ்லீம் என்று முன்னிலைப்படுத்தி இருந்தது. மறுபுறத்தில் மற்றொரு பத்திரிகை அவ்வாறு செய்யவில்லை. அதே போல இன்னொரு உதாரணத்தையும் அவர் முன்வைத்தார். இவ்வுதாரணத்திலும் சந்தேக நபர்கள் தமிழர் என்று முன்னிலைப்படுத்தப்பட்டிருந்தது. 2 உதாரணங்களிலும் இனத்தை குறிப்பிடாமல் எடுக்கப்பட்ட செய்திகளையும் காட்டினார். அப்படியான சூழலில் இந்த 2 உதாரணத்திலும் இனம் எவ்வாறு தொடர்பு பட்டது என்று கேள்வியை கேட்டார். නිරන්දි ඔයාට පුළුවන් අපිට තවත් උදාහරණ කිහිපයක් පෙන්වන්න.
ස්තුතියි රෝෂය. මම ඊළඟ උදාහරණයට යන්නම්. දෙවෙනි ඔයාට පුළුවන් ඊළඟ ස්ලයිඩ් එකට යන්න. ඔබ දන්නවා කොවිඩ් රෝගය දැන් විශාල වශයෙන් ව්‍යාප්ත වෙනවා. මේ රෝගයට බොහෝ අය ගොදුරු වෙනවා. ඔබට මේ පෙනෙන පුවතෙන් පෙනෙන්නේ කොවිඩ් රෝගය වැළඳුණු වෛද්‍යවරයෙක් ඉගැන්වීමේ කටයුත්තක යෙදීමේදී ඔහුගෙන් මේ රෝගය අනෙක් අයට වැළඳී ඇති පුවතක්. මේ පුවත කියවද්දී අපට පෙනෙන දෙයක් තමයි මේ පුද්ගලයා මේ රෝගය ව්‍යාප්ත කළ බවට හැඟවෙන ආකාරයෙන් තමයි වාර්තා කරලා තියෙන්නේ. මේ වාර්ගිකත්වය ඉස්මතු කරලා තියෙනවා. අපට පෙනුණු ආකාරයට මෙවැනි පුවත් විශාල වශයෙන් මේ සමයේ වාර්තා කිරීමක් දක්නට ලැබෙනවා. මේ හේතුව නිසාම සෞඛ්‍ය වෛද්‍ය දෙපාර්තමේන්තුව මාර්ගෝපදේශන මාලාවක් නිකුත් කරන්නට යෙදුණ වාර්තාකරුවන්ට ඒ උපදේශන මාලාවේ කොවිඩ් වැළඳුණු රෝගීන්ගේ අනන්‍යතාවය පළ කරන්න එපා. ඒ වගේම ඔවුන්ගේ වාර්ගිකත්වය පළ කරන්න එපා කියන එකත් ඔවුන් සඳහන් කරලා තිබුණා. ඔබට වම් පසින් පෙනෙන උදාහරණය ගත්තොත් මම ඔබට මේ ඔබට පෙනෙන්නේ කතුවැකියක්. මේ මාතෘකාව විදියට සඳහන් කරලා තියෙන්නේ පාහරයෝ යනුවෙන්. කතුවැකෙන් කියවෙන්නේ හරක් හොරකමක් සම්බන්ධ පුවතක් පිළිබඳව. හරක් හොරකම් කළ අයගේ වාර්ගිකත්වය මුස්ලිම් යනුවෙන් මෙහි සඳහන් කරලා තියෙනවා. මම කැමති ඊළඟ නිදසුනට යන්න. නිරෝධායනයට යොමු වුණු පිරිසක් පිළිබඳව තමයි ඊළඟ නිදසුන වාර්තා කරලා තියෙන්නේ. එහිදී 3 දෙනෙක්ගෙන් එක් අයෙකුගේ වාර්ගිකත්වය පමණක් ඉස්මතු කරලා තියෙනවා. ඔබට දැක ගන්න පුළුවන්. පුවත එන්නේ 60 දෙමළ මාධ්‍යවේදියෙකු ඇතුළු 3 දෙනෙක් ස්වන් නිරෝධායනයට කියලා 3 දෙනාගෙන් එක් පුද්ගලයෙකුගේ වාර්ගිකත්වය දෙමළ යනුවෙන් ඔවුන් ඉස්මතු කරලා තියෙනවා. එහිදී වාර්ගිකත්වය සඳහන් කිරීම ඍජුවම ප්‍රවෘත්තියට අදාළ වනවාද යන ප්‍රශ්නාර්ථය මම ඔබට යොමු කරන්න කැමතියි. ඉංග්‍රීසි දමිළ මාධ්‍යයෙන් ඔබට මේ පිළිබඳව වැඩි පැහැදිලි කිරීමක් ගෙනේවි ස්ටෙෆනි රොෂෙල් විසින්.
Thank you, Nirandi. So Nirandi was able to show us 2 more examples where the ethnic and religious identities of individuals were mentioned in news items where their identities were not directly relevant to that particular news story. What I'd like to do is, from the 3 examples that she showed us, I'd like to focus on 2 examples. These 2 examples are the COVID-19 related examples that she showed us. And the reason that I want to focus on those 2 examples is because I'm sure that we all remember in the last year how different ethnic and religious minorities were negatively perceived in society. And moreover, I'm sure we also remember how they were even blamed for the spread of COVID-19. And so because of that, it's important for us to remember that this type of news report emerged in such a context. So let's look at the 2 examples that she mentioned on COVID-19. In the first example, there's a news report of an individual who was conducting tuition classes and contracted the virus. Now, that particular news report mentions the individual's ethnic or religious identity as Muslim. Let's also take a look at the second example, because I think in this example, it becomes quite clear when you see that there are 3 individuals here who were asked to quarantine. However, from the 3 individuals, only one individual's ethnic identity is mentioned in the news report. And that's what we've highlighted here. The identity of that individual being a Tamil individual is clearly highlighted for the reader. So once again, this is able to highlight, or rather it speaks to what Nirandi was able to show us and ask us about, was ethnic and religious identities really relevant to these news stories? Or was there a way in which these news items could have been reported by refraining or from avoiding publishing their ethnic and religious identities? And then another point is whether or why is it that we tend to see minority identities in terms of ethnic minorities, in terms of religious minorities mentioned in negative contexts such as these? Rochelle, perhaps you can provide a translation or a summary in Tamil. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephanie. இந்த பகுதியில் நிரம்பி இன்னும் சில உதாரணங்களை முன்வைத்தார். கோவிட்-19 பரவுவதற்கு சிறுபான்மையினர் குற்றம் சாட்டப்பட்ட சூழலில் இனத்தை குறிப்பிடுவது சிக்கலாக இருந்ததை அவர் முன்வைத்தார். முதலாவதாக ஒரு டியூஷன் கொடுக்கும் வைத்தியருக்கு கொரோனா பரவியுள்ள செய்தி. இதில் அந்த வைத்தியர் ஒரு முஸ்லீம் என்று குறிப்பிடப்பட்டிருந்தது. அதேபோல் அகுரண பிரதேசத்தில் மாடுகளை களுவெடுத்த சம்பவத்திலும் சந்தேக நபர்கள் முஸ்லீம் இனத்தவர் என்று குறிப்பிடப்பட்டிருந்தது. இரண்டாவது உதாரணம் ஹட்டன் நகரில் சில நபர்களை தனிமைப்படுத்தியது பற்றியது. இதிலும் கூட மற்றவர்கள் இருக்கும் போது ஒரு தமிழ் ஊடகவியலாளர் என்று முன்னிலைப்படுத்தப்பட்டிருந்தது. இதிலும் கூட அவரின் இனம் எவ்வாறு இந்த செய்திக்கு தொடர்பு பட்டது என்று கேள்வி கேட்டார். From media profiling, let's now take a shift and look and focus a bit on the second ailment, which is the media polarization across languages. Media polarization is where the media is divided across different ideologies or languages. In Sri Lanka, we see media polarization as a huge issue across languages, where the same issue or event is discussed in totally two different manners. We run the platform The Divide to really compare and contrast Sinhala and Tamil media coverage on a common national level issue or event. You can check our work via the TMA Twitter handle and Verité Research's Instagram handle. Let's go through three areas of examples from The Divide that clearly shows the language divide in the country. The first divides on sacred sites. Perhaps, Stephanie, you could come to that slide. So sacred sites have a long history in Sri Lanka, and often their history is complicated due to various invasions, migrations, and infusion of religious beliefs and practices in the country. So it's really hard to pinpoint the true history of a site. And we see this being reflected in the media as well. This particular example that you'll see on the screen is about a sacred site in Kanya Trincomalee, near the famous 7 hot water springs. In 2019, there were some tensions near the site, and what we did was compare the coverage on it. What we saw was that the very same site was discussed in two totally different ways in the Sinhala and Tamil media. First, the Sinhala and Tamil newspapers identified the site in two different manners. The Sinhala newspapers called it an ancient Buddhist site, a vihara that was built by King Bhatikatissa, and the very same site was called an ancient Hindu Kovil, built during King Ravana's era in the Tamil newspapers. You can also see the difference in how the newspapers characterized the issue. The Sinhala newspapers showed the issue as a threat to Sinhala Buddhist heritage and identity in the north and east, whereas the Tamil newspapers, on the other hand, saw this as the Sinhalization or Buddhistization of the north and east. இரண்டாவது பகுதியில் மீடியா போலரைசேஷன் அல்லது ஊடக துருவமயப்படுத்தல் பற்றி கதைப்போம். தி டிவைட் என்னும் சமூக ஊடக தளத்தில் இருந்து உதாரணங்கள் சிலதை பார்ப்போம். முதலாவதாக நாங்கள் புனித தலங்கள் பற்றிய ஊடக பிளவுகளை நோக்கும் போது கன்யா வெந்நீரூற்றுக்கு அருகில் உள்ள ஒரு புனித தலத்தை பற்றி பார்ப்போம். ஒரே இடத்தை சிங்கள மற்றும் தமிழ் பத்திரிகைகள் முறையே பௌத்த விஹார என்றும், தமிழ் பத்திரிகைகள் இதை ஒரு இந்து கோவில் என்றும் அடையாளப்படுத்தியிருந்தனர். அதே போல புனித தலங்கள் பற்றிய பிரச்சனை தமிழ் பத்திரிகைகள் பௌத்தமயமாக்கல் அல்லது சிங்களமயமாக்கல் என்றும், சிங்கள பத்திரிகைகள் இதை வடக்கு மற்றும் கிழக்கில் உள்ள சிங்கள மற்றும் பௌத்த அடையாளங்களுக்கு ஒரு அச்சுறுத்தலாக இருக்கிறது என்று கூறியிருந்தனர். Perhaps, Stephanie, would you like to summarize this in Sinhala for us?
Sure, Rochelle. මේ උදාහරණයෙන් පෙන්වන්නේ ත්‍රිකුණාමලේ කන්‍යාවල පූජනීය ස්ථානයක් සිංහල හා දමිළ පුවත්පත් වාර්තා කරපු වෙනස් ආකාරය. සිංහල පුවත්පත්වල එම ස්ථානයේ ඉතිහාසය වාර්තා කිරීමේදී එය බාතික තිස්ස රජුගේ කාලේ ඉදිකළ ස්ථානයක් ලෙස සඳහන් කරලා තියෙනවා. නමුත් දමිළ පුවත්පත්වල එම ස්ථානය හඳුනාගෙන තියෙන්නේ රාවණා රජුගේ කාලේ ඉදිකළ ස්ථානයක් ලෙස. ඒ වගේම රොෂල් තවත් කරුණක් ගැන කතා කරා. මේ ස්ථානයේ යම්කිසි සිද්ධියක් වුණා. ඒ සිද්ධිය සිංහල පුවත්පත්වල හඳුනාගෙන තිබ්බේ සිංහල බෞද්ධ උරුමයට එල්ල වූ තර්ජනයක් ලෙස. නමුත් දමිළ පුවත්පත්වල එම සිද්ධිය විස්තර කරලා තිබ්බේ නැත්නම් හඳුනාගෙන තිබ්බේ සිංහලකරණය හා බෞද්ධාගම්කරණය. Rochelle, you can proceed to the next section.
Thank you, Stephanie. The second set of divides are on social concerns, and often some concerns are given more prominence in one language media over the other. Let's look through two examples such as this. The first example is on malnutrition. In 2019, a child died reportedly due to malnutrition in Tissa Maharama. What we observed was that the Sinhala media gave significant coverage for the issue, whereas the Tamil media had only a very handful of articles on it. Malnutrition is a national level issue in Sri Lanka that is not isolated to just Tissa Maharama or even the southern province. It's a wider problem in society that warrants a larger discussion. Another example is the hunger strike and satyagraha organized in 2019, opposing and in some cases supporting the creation of a divisional secretariat in Kalmar. We saw the Tamil newspapers covered very widely, almost around 170 articles, whereas the Sinhala newspapers only had a very few number of articles, 7. Again, a delimitation of boundaries and issues over divisional secretariats are not isolated to just Kalmune, but are larger national level issues involving the electoral system of the country. இரண்டாவது வகையான பிளவுகள் தேசிய அளவிலான சமுதாய பிரச்சனைகள் பற்றியது. இதில் 2 உதாரணங்களை கூறினேன். முதலாவது திஸ்ஸ மகாராமாவில் ஊட்டச்சத்து குறைபாடினால் மரணித்த ஒரு குழந்தையை பற்றிய சம்பவம். இதற்கு சிங்கள பத்திரிகைகள் மிக கூடுதலான முக்கியத்துவமும் இடமும் கொடுத்திருந்தன. ஆனால் தமிழ் பத்திரிகைகள் கூடிய அளவு முக்கியத்துவம் கொடுக்கவில்லை. இதே போன்று கல்முனை நகரில் நடந்த சத்தியாகிரகம் மற்றும் உண்ணாவிரத போராட்டத்தை பற்றியும் நாம் பார்த்தோம். இதிலும் தமிழ் பத்திரிகைகள் மிக கூடுதலான முக்கியத்துவமும் இடமும் கொடுத்திருந்தன. ஆனால் சிங்கள பத்திரிகைகள் கூடிய அளவு முக்கியத்துவம் கொடுக்கவில்லை. Maybe Stephanie, can you please explain this in Sinhala for us?
Sure, Rochelle. Rochelle, සමාජ ගැටලු දෙකක් ගැන කතා කරා. පළමු වන උදාහරණයෙන් තිස්ස මහරාමේ මන්ද පෝෂණයෙන් මියගිය දරුවෙක් ගැන සිද්ධියක් සිංහල හා දමිළ පුවත්පත් වාර්තා කරපු වෙනස් ආකාරය අපිට ඒ පළමු වන ඉන්ෆෝග්‍රැෆික් එකෙන් දකින්න පුළුවනි. මන්ද පෝෂණය අපි හැමෝම දන්නවා රටේ බොහෝ ප්‍රදේශවලට බලපාන බරපතල ප්‍රශ්නයක්. නමුත් ඒ අවස්ථාවේදී සිංහල පුවත්පත් දමිළ පුවත්පත් වලට වඩා වැඩි ආවරණයක් ලබා දීලා තිබ්බා. එතකොට අපි මේ දෙවනි උදාහරණය ගත්තොත් මේක කල්මුනේ ප්‍රදේශයේ සත්‍යග්‍රහයක් පිළිබඳව නිවුස් රිපෝට් එකක්. දැන් මේ අවස්ථාවේදී දමිළ පුවත්පත් සිංහල පුවත්පත් වලට වඩා වැඩි ආවරණයක් ලබා දීලා තියෙනවා. Thanks, Rochelle. You can move to the next section.
Thank you, Stephanie. So the final set of divides on the reflections on the end of the war. Now, the war really affected all the communities in the country. And whenever we reflect on the war, we have different views on it. And often these views are very personal and very emotional. We saw these being reflected in the headlines that was published on the 19th May of this year. Most Sinhala newspaper headings reflected on the war as a celebration or a war victory. They focused on the sacrifices of national war heroes. Meanwhile, most Tamil newspapers, on the other hand, reflected on the war as a commemoration of the bereaved. They really focused on remembrance events held at Mullivaikal. We also see some of these divides being reflected on TV coverage as well, especially when reflecting on war-related anniversaries and events. Here is an example where the Sinhala TV channels gave coverage to the Kokaville attack, whereas the Tamil TV channels did not cover it at all. In the same way, the 38th anniversary of Black July was featured exclusively in the Tamil TV channels and not in the Sinhala TV channels. எமது கடைசி உதாரணங்கள் எமது நாட்டில் இருந்த போரை பற்றியது. யுத்தம் நாட்டின் அனைத்து சமூகங்களையும் பாதித்தது. நாம் போரை பற்றி சிந்திக்கும் போதும் அது குறித்து நமக்கு மாறுபட்ட பார்வைகள் இருக்கும். இந்த ஆண்டு மே 19 அன்று வெளியிடப்பட்ட பத்திரிகைகளின் தலைப்புகளில் இவை பிரதிபலித்ததை கண்டோம். பெரும்பாலான சிங்கள செய்தித்தாள் தலைப்புகள் போரின் இறுதியை ஒரு கொண்டாட்டம் அல்லது போர் வெற்றி என பிரதிபலித்தன. மறுபுறத்தில் பெரும்பாலான தமிழ் செய்தித்தாள் தலைப்புகள் போரில் மரணித்தவர்களை நினைவுபடுத்தி இருந்தன. அவர்கள் முள்ளிவாய்க்காலில் நடைபெற்ற நினைவேந்தல் மற்றும் நினைவு நிகழ்வுகளை பற்றி கவனம் செலுத்தியிருந்தனர். டிவி கவரேஜிலும் நமக்கு இவ்வாறான பிளவுகளை பார்க்க முடியும். குறிப்பாக போர் தொடர்பான நிகழ்வுகளை பிரதிபலிக்கும் போது. உதாரணமாக கொகாவில் யுத்தத்தை பற்றி சிங்கள டிவி சேனல்ஸ் மட்டுமே ஒளிபரப்பியிருந்தன. அதே போல் கருப்பு ஜூலை பற்றி தமிழ் டிவி சேனல்ஸ் மட்டுமே ஒளிபரப்பி இருந்தன. නිරන්දි මේක සිංහලෙන් පොඩ්ඩක් එක්ස්ප්ලেইন කරන්න පුළුවන්ද අපිට?
ඔව්. රොෂෙල් පැහැදිලි කර ආකාරයට පශ්චාත් යුද වාර්තාකරණය සිංහල දමිළ මාධ්‍ය වාර්තා කර තිබුණේ කෙසේද යන්න සොයා බැලීමේදී සිංහල මුද්‍රිත මාධ්‍ය පුවත් රණවිරු සැමරුම යුද ජයග්‍රහණය ලෙසින් වාර්තා කර තිබීමක් දකින්න ලැබුණා. දමිළ මුද්‍රිත මාධ්‍ය වාර්තා කර තිබුණේ මියගිය අය සැමරීම හිමත් නැත්නම් අනුස්මරණයන් ලෙසින්. මුද්‍රිත මාධ්‍ය වගේම රොෂෙල් විසින් රූපවාහිනී මාධ්‍ය පිළිබඳවත් දත්ත සොයා බැලීමක් සිදු කරලා තියෙනවා. එහිදී රූපවාහිනී මාධ්‍ය තුල කොකාවිල් සැමරුම පිළිබඳව පුවත් නිරීක්ෂණයේදී සිංහල මාධ්‍ය පුවත් ඒ පිළිබඳව වාර්තා කළ අතර දමිළ මාධ්‍ය ඒ සම්බන්ධව කිසිවක් වාර්තා කර තිබුණේ නැහැ. එමෙන්ම කළු ජූලිය සම්බන්ධ පුවත් දමිළ මාධ්‍ය වාර්තා කර තිබූ අතර සිංහල මාධ්‍ය ඒ පිළිබඳව කිසිදු පුවතක් වාර්තා කර තිබුණේ නැහැ. Over to you, Rochelle.
Thank you, Nirandi. With that, we really come to the end of our presentation. And in our presentation, we highlighted some examples from our platforms, the divide and ethics side, on two media ailments, media polarization across languages and ethno-religious profiling. Perhaps now we can take a shift and hear some possible impacts and solutions to these ailments from our guest speakers, Amantha and Munza. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts on this. Deepanjali, perhaps you can introduce our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Rochelle, for that very clear, detailed presentation. Let me first now introduce Amantha. Let me also share a little bit about Amantha, though everybody knows both Amantha and Munza very well. Amantha Perera is a researcher at the School of Education and the Arts Central Queensland University. His current project examines online trauma impact on journalism during COVID-19 lockdowns. The project is one of the first to explore the confluence of online trauma, journalism, and the pandemic. The project will be completed at the end of 2021. Amantha has this enviable position of being a journalist and a researcher. We hope that Amantha will be able to bring both perspectives. The floor is yours, Amantha.
Thank you. I probably wouldn't call myself having an enviable position, but nevertheless, I found it really apt that the presentations before me referred to racial profiling and polarization as ailments. And I think it's quite apt given the times that we live in and what we have gone through in the past 20 or so months. But I probably wouldn't call those two as ailments. I feel that they are more symptoms of ailments that have been in our media culture, have been in our media industry for generations, and they are much more, the defects are much more systemic. So racial profiling, polarization, I see them as symptoms of a system that's probably broken somewhere, not probably in one place, but quite a few places. And I'd like to look at two areas that I think are quite important if we are to address not only the focus of this conversation, which is racial profiling and polarization, but a lot of other things that we tend to talk about the Sri Lankan media and try to fix them. I've been involved with the Sri Lankan media industry as a journalist, as a trainer, as a commentator in all kinds of roles. And every time I come to these kind of meetings and webinars, I feel as if like I'm just running around the bush here. It always seems to be same situation, a different topic. We've talked about reporting ethically. We've talked about how war reporting has been biased, fake news, misinformation, disinformation. And I see that we understand what really is problematic in our media, but we need to address why these things are happening, not only in Sri Lankan media, but in other media as well. Two things that I like to talk about today. One is that part of the reason why we are seeing these kind of really endemic issues in the Sri Lankan media is that there is a serious erosion of skills and professionalism. And this didn't start happening yesterday. This didn't start happening 2 months ago, 3 months ago. This has been generational, historic. And the problem, as I see it, is not about talent. And some of the journalists that I've worked with and worked under in Sri Lanka are undoubtedly some of the best in the world. I think we have the best talent. The problem, as I see it, is enhancing that talent and retaining that talent. We have really good people joining the Sri Lanka media at entry level. But as they move up the ladder, as they become senior reporters, gatekeepers, editors, stars in their newsrooms, most of them don't live up to their potential that they showed when they were beginning. And there are reasons for that. Now, one of the things is that we tend to have this attitude, and which I think is a really wrong attitude, is that this is a job where you learn on the job. When I joined as a journalist, one of the first things that I heard was you either learn or you either swim or you sink. But one thing that I saw was there were lots of people who were just hanging on to the side of the swimming pool. And I couldn't really understand what you were supposed to learn when the people you were supposed to learn didn't exactly know what they were doing. So this attitude of learning on the job is not really working for us. Now, there are reasons for that. When the system is rotten, you can't expect people who join that system to come out as perfect products. They become influenced by that system. And the Sri Lankan media ecology is such that I think we foster conformity and not new thinking, not out of the box thinking. And I tend to consider myself lucky that I worked in a media institution, and especially under an editor who actually went against that trend. Someone who really not only supported but encouraged people who wanted to do new things and wanted to do things in ways that are different to others. But I don't think that's a norm in our media culture. So because of that, what we have is most of the time those who conform to the system. So if the system is not working properly, so those who conform, who are going up that conveyor belt, also don't become perfect products. They become part and parcel of the problem instead of trying to at least mend it a little bit. We also have this idea that we tend to look outside of the country and try to think, okay, we will try to imitate what's happening outside, and then we will be all right. And this happens from writing styles to mastheads. That really doesn't work. We need to think about what is Sri Lankan media culture. What do we mean as being Sri Lankan media and Sri Lankan journalists? Now, there's also this very big issue of pay. If you want to retain the best talent, you need to pay them the appropriate remuneration. You pay peanuts. We all know what you get. And what I've witnessed is that young talent, when they know that they're really good, if they're not encouraged, if they don't see prospects to widen their careers, they go into other areas. And this is happening from the day I joined the media, before that, and up until now. Most of the journalists or others that I have mentored are not in the media field now. They are all over the place. They're scattered. And when you see that talent pool, and you start thinking, what if they remained in the media? So as much as we talk about enhancing skills, as much as we talk about training, as much as we detail these various problems that are hampering progress in our media, we really need to also address why aren't journalists not being paid? You have a few journalists who get paid really well, and then you have everybody else who doesn't. And given what has happened in the last 20 months or so, most of the journalists that I have spoken to in Sri Lanka talk about financial uncertainty, that they need to do other things or they need to look for other employment just to make ends meet. So pay is a big issue. We need to really look at that if we are going to keep not only the best talent, but also make that talent much more pronounced within our media. The other area is the lack of institutes that work on building skills for media, building skills for reporting, for journalism. We have the institutes. There's no doubt about it. There are private institutes, there are university level organizations, there are internationally funded ventures. We have probably close to 10 such ventures going on right now in Sri Lanka. But what we really need to look at is that all these things together, not only those who are working right now, but those who have started worked in the future, whether they have gained a return on their investment, whether with this massive investment on journalism training has created a cohort of journalists who are performing better than they would have otherwise or better than yesterday. And my honest assessment is that they haven't given us that return on investment. So the issue is, have we identified the needs of the Sri Lankan media? What does Sri Lankan media need right now for it to perform better than yesterday? There I want to kind of link into this other part that I just wanted to highlight is the lack of expertise to address building skills, training journalists. What I see is that in Sri Lanka, we have the scaffolding that is needed for skills enhancement. So we have the structure, but where we kind of go wrong or where we are lacking is that what we have to fill those structures. We have the skeleton, but what do we fill that skeleton with? That's where we have an issue. Journalism skills training requires certain attributes. It's not just being a journalist. It's not just being a trainer. I think both of those things should come together. And what I see in Sri Lanka is that we don't have that kind of a training talent pool. We have experienced journalists who have gone into training, but they do not have the type of skills to impart skillful training. We need to balance that mismatch. We need journalism educators who kind of bring in a certain level of academic discipline and rigor, where the training is influenced by evidence-based research, not just anecdotal research. And we need also to combine that with the flair of journalism. And it's a bit of a tall ask, and we don't have that right now. It's not that we can't make it, but we need to really look at who is training journalists in Sri Lanka right now. Now, because of time, I'll just kind of, try to round this up by one simple incident. Now, recently, there was this Me Too movement moment in Sri Lanka, where several female journalist and former journalist took this tremendous and enormously courageous risk and spoke about what they had to endure in their newsrooms. Now that kind of created this momentary, what I call a blip. It was a transient blip. Suddenly we had media activists, media trainers, everyone started talking about it. And there was this commotion around this. Now, but what I saw was that the same people who were talking about investigative journalism, the same people who were talking about fake news, the same people who were talking about climate journalism were becoming experts on this as well. That's possible, but I didn't see that expertise there. Now, what happened with this? The government bought, and they said they couldn't go ahead with any kind of investigation or anything into that. Now, where are we today? It's just become a transient blip. Are we better equipped? Are our newsrooms better equipped to deal with this than before? No, we are not. And finally, what I wanted to highlight was that why that has happened is that we didn't have the required skill sets to understand the issue and how to address that within newsrooms. So that's just one example. But as just, kind of going back to where I started, I see two things that are happening. There may be more, but I just want to highlight two things: that racial profiling, polarization are symptoms of systemic defects in Sri Lankan media industry and the community. And two of them are the erosion of skills and the inability or the lack of access to expertise to match that skills erosion. Thank you.
Thank you, Amantha, for highlighting all those concerns, which I can definitely look forward to discussing more in depth when the Q&A session starts. Now, I'd like to actually invite Munza Mushtaq, our second guest speaker. Munza is a journalist based in Sri Lanka with over 21 years experience. She began her career as a trainee journalist at the Daily Mirror newspaper in 2000 and has gone on to serve as news editor to the Sunday Leader and the Nation newspapers. Her byline has appeared in several international publications, including the Los Angeles Times and Al Jazeera. At present, she works as a freelance journalist, among many other areas. Her work focuses on minority matters, human rights, and politics in Sri Lanka. Over to you, Munza.
Thank you, Deepanjali. I heard Amantha's speech, and I think I would like to focus more on a newsroom sort of an aspect. If I take back when I started as a journalist a little over 21 years back, one of the first things that was given to me as a cub journalist was the Code of Ethics by the Editors Guild. And we were basically told to follow this. And to date, 21 years later, it's something I do follow. However, I think today, when you look at most of the news reporting, the style that has been adopted, I'm certain that many of the journalists, whether they are with the print media or TV, they may not have even heard of something called the Code of Ethics. Because I believe our profession is such that we have to be guided by something called ethics, because the truth is we have the power to make a person or also to destroy a person. And I think it's very sad to say, as a journalist myself, in the past few years, I have been seeing how newspapers, TV have been reporting, specifically if you take certain Muslim professionals, it could be a doctor, it could be a lawyer. The newspaper doesn't report anymore. They are like the judge and the jury. So I think we've come to a point where we need to do a fundamental change, and it has to start from the top, not at the bottom. Because if the editors are straight, if the editors are ethically, if they understand what ethics is, you can channel that to the bottom. So that's one thing I would like to speak. The other thing about the polarization, for example,
when a newspaper reports about an incident, they tend to, especially the Sinhala media, I cannot read Tamil, so I'm not really sure how that works, but it's very often they say things like Muslim a suspect. They always highlight the fact of that person's ethnicity. But if you take, for example, even the past few days, I have been getting news alerts about that incident where a 15-year-old girl, who died, who was employed at Rishad Badiuddin's house, and almost every other day I get an alert, a news alert from various TV channels. But I think we've forgotten about a story which happened just before that, where it involved a politician. Now, basically, what the media is trying to do is they try to portray, they try to show that the Muslims are bad, but you have to give the same amount of attention to both incidents because it's a child abuse case. And it doesn't become a more serious crime based on a person's ethnicity. But the media has come to a point where they report it in a way, if it's a Muslim suspect or a culprit, that is a far serious crime, whereas when it's somebody else, they act like eventually they stop reporting and the people forget. Because in Sri Lanka, we all know that we all have a very, very bad memory. Within like 2 to 3 days, we tend to forget. So I think we have to understand that a crime doesn't be more serious based on a person's ethnicity. If he is a criminal, he is a criminal. It doesn't matter if he is Muslim or Tamil or Sinhala or Christian or anything, or even an atheist for that matter. So I just want to highlight that, but if you all have any questions, you can please feel free to ask me.
Thank you, Munza. I think you did drive home the points about all those legal concerns. Perhaps now let me invite Stephanie to actually administer the questionnaire, and then we can perhaps move on to the moderation session. Stephanie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, and thank you very much to Amantha and Munza for sharing your insights into these areas that we've also tried to highlight through our different platforms. It was an opportunity for me, and I'm sure for everyone else as well, to really think through these areas that you raised. What I'd like to do now, before we move into the question and answer session, is for us to administer another very short questionnaire. So this is the same set of questions that our participants answered previously. Amantha will share the link to this questionnaire on the chat. This will just help us to get a sense of whether this session has been educational thus far and whether it has shed light on certain areas that some of us may not have been familiar with previously. So you can click on this link and take this very quick questionnaire for 2 minutes, and then thereafter we can have the question and answer session. Thank you.
While people are filling up the questionnaire, Stephanie, maybe we can also talk about the ground rules for the question and answer session and set it up. Dipanjali, do you want me to take over, or are you going to introduce that initially?
Nishan, please take over. I think now it's probably the Q&A session. Okay.
So sorry to make you fill up questionnaires. It may seem sort of very simplistic, but we live in the age where we count so many things at Verité. So we try to quantify everything, and just being able to get a sense of feedback, where can we improve, what we can do better. These things help us, and otherwise we become our own jury, as it were. So that's why we're asking you to fill in some questions. In terms of asking questions, it really helps if you can type in your question on the chat, because that queues it up for us and we can see them. So feel free to type. But of course, there's no inhibition for you asking it yourself. So even if you type and you say, look, I'd like to ask it, then I can call upon you to ask the question verbally and others can hear it. One way to indicate that you like to ask a question is to use the raise your hand feature. that is there on all of our platforms and on this as well. So you can just raise your hand, and then so right on top next to the sort of I think next to the chat box, there's something that allows you to sort of have a reaction, and one is raise your hand. And then Rochelle and others will tell me who has raised their hands, and we can call upon you to ask questions and discuss. Okay. So let me, I know you all are still filling in questions, are still filling in the survey. Answers haven't come in. But let me just start by thanking Amantha and Munza for the feedback they gave, and just perhaps framing what we did today in a sort of the perspective of the national importance of this for the way Verité looks at the problem also. We think we democracy as it is in the modern day envisaged is foundationally built around the idea that media is central to the workings of a democracy. So when people talk about the existence of the parliament, the executive, the judiciary, we also talk about the media when you use the term fourth estate, that media is a fundamentally critical institution for democracy. And I want to just say my perception of why that is the case, right? Media is important, if I put it very simply, I think, for two fundamental reasons. For the process of public reasoning, I think in a democracy, we believe that ultimately the majority come together and vote. And in voting, we try to somehow have some kind of convergence and compromise around diverse interests. But the way those interests are actually arbitered are ultimately not by just having a leader that favors one side over the other. The polarized society isn't a good way to do democracy, or majoritarianism, where the majority gets to dictate everything to everybody else. But the process of public reasoning, where people are debating, hearing each other's points of view, seeing the reasons of the others, is a space in which actually the democratic space or the possibility of democracy is shaped. Without that public reasoning, we get into deep trouble. And this is why, this is one reason I think it's so important when we talk about the polarization in media and the divisions that are created, that the process of public reasoning is poisoned. We don't even hear the views of others, of people who speak in Tamil, people who speak in Sinhalese, and there is a kind of structural difficulty in forging a nation state and a democracy when there isn't a convergence of ideas and discussion or discourse. So it's the discourse. Second, I would say the public reasoning is one. Second is empathy, social empathy. Amartya Sen, in his famous thesis about why famines never occurred in democracy, makes the point that it's simply because people get outraged about what happens to other people. It's not because starving people don't vote because they die and you can't vote, but because other people get outraged. There is a social empathy that's created. So in what Rochelle highlighted about the way we portray different histories, the way we portray different memories, different empathy in society, this pollutes also that social empathy that is so critical for forming a healthy society and a democracy. So really, these are very, very serious problems. And what Verité is doing is, I think, quantifying the existence of the problem, building case studies that journalists themselves can learn from and reflect on. And one of the things we see is that, journalists are quite excited about it. I mean, sometimes they report to us and say, my organization violated this ethic today. Can you discuss it? So that brings me to my first question to Amantha. Okay, Amantha, so why do journalists come to us and say, my organization violated this ethic? Can you post it on Ethics Eye and can encourage us to carry it? I would say, that, you highlighted two big issues, right? That inherent prejudice gets amplified, that the skilling process isn't happening adequately. But is there a problem of power? And I think Munza hinted at that, right? That basically editorial power, ownership power, that then tells you what to do, right? And now where journalists aren't quite free now. The classic, what I would say a postmodernism is journalism is truth with Samudika. How he could one day be criticizing the government vehemently, and then of course the brother of the owner of his station is released from death row, and Chamudika becomes an apologist for government, right? So is there something about power now? By all means, he seems like a very talented journalist, right? I don't know. So let's just reflect on, maybe ask you all to comment on that question. Is there some structural issue here? Or is it simply skills and training and knowledge that is at the core of it? How would you reflect on that problem? Yeah.
Well, I mean, to start off, I think it's a really encouraging development that journalists are coming to you and coming out with those kind of violations. A few years back, I think they would have seen it, and the only option would have been to talk among themselves, and then there's nothing to it. And obviously, power structure is an issue in Sri Lankan media because, again, we go back to the ecology of media institutes, how they are structured. And there's always that unseen power base. You know the powerful journalists, you know the powerful editors, and you sense where that power is coming through. And to link it to what I spoke about, skills and professionalism. If you have a very professional structure, that ethics guideline that Munza spoke about would have been much more established. You would know what happens to you if you contravene it. In most Sri Lankan newsrooms, that's not the case. You see ethics violations, blatant violations happening day in, day out. So you evolve within a structure where there is violations happening and you know it's happening, but there is no benchmark where you can figure out what is right and what is wrong. And this is true for individual news organization as well as a community. We have for almost 20 years now, Sri Lanka Press Institute. We have the free media movement that's been there for longer than that. But we still haven't been able to bring the entire community together and at least agree on core journalism principles. And now I think that's where the skills come into play, because we don't still consider journalism as a profession that needs professional skills enhancement. We don't have the benchmarks for that, right? We don't have the institutes where journalists will go and get trained, and those institutes are recognized and benchmarked, and then they come back. So we just keep going in this circle, like I said, and we still don't know how to break that circle. So I think it's a combination of factors, but I'm really glad that at least you're getting the inside track of these ethics violations. And I think the next step for you is probably not to out the violators by name, but out how the violations happen within news organizations. Just to take an example as a story and say, this is how it was reported. Whether there was a discussion about bringing all sides of the story, whether there was a discussion about the headline not being authentic or reflective of the story. I think that's the next step, because if this is not happening at community level, at the industry level, I think we need to look at interventions that are happening outside of that.
Thank you very much. So yeah, so I think journalists are doing that in order to have a conversation with their editors who they think are misbehaving, of course, and they feel empowered when we carry it. But the other kind of pushback we get, I think, is to say, hey, you guys, this is unfair. Like, you don't understand the pressure we work under. It's so difficult. and it's easy for you to criticize our journalism or what we do. So Munza, I think we always think to ourselves, we need to also build empathy with the people in the profession. We need to understand their struggles. I mean, it's fair that people are under enormous pressures, right? Do you have anything to say, perhaps in defense of journalism? I mean, you are an active journalist, you are constantly sort of still in the field and writing and editing. Perhaps we should, say, look, is there something we don't understand about the struggle of a journalist that explains some of these things, and that we should look at more sympathetically, perhaps to how journalists function in the country? Yeah.
Okay, so I worked across several newsrooms in Sri Lanka before I stopped writing locally and I started writing for foreign media. Personally, if I know my editor is biased, I have countless times gone and fought with him and said, this is wrong. Because you can't stand up for something that's right outside when you're not standing up for when you can't stand up for what's right within your newsroom. And I mean, I'm not saying that you have to write a story in a way where you have to reflect your personal opinion, but there are times you have to make sure you get the basics, the fundamentals across, like who, where, when, what, why, and how. But nowadays you don't see that happening. It's just you actually take a story and you see if a person is a racist, he or she makes it very obvious in the way that person is reporting it. And that copy that is written by the journalist is passed through the news editor, it's passed through the subs, and then sometimes the editor also sees it. But there is absolutely no action being taken against it. So that's why I keep saying this is a problem at the top. You have to, I mean, I understand it's a job security. You can't sometimes, when you're a new journalist, it's difficult for you to fight with your editor. But if you're not standing up for what's right, then the whole point of journalism is also, what does it mean? What are you trying to do? You're supposed to write the truth. You're supposed to inform the people. So it's very complicated. I cannot defend people who would just sit at the newsroom, only worry about their byline when they're not standing up for what's right. In another case, like if you take, for example, the Divina story, which basically implicated Dr. Shafi with that sterilization story. I mean, to date, what has happened? There is insufficient evidence, but a man's entire career was destroyed. So where do we draw the line? What action will the Press Complaints Commission? What action will maybe the Editors Guild? What action would they take? Would they be willing to take action against the newspaper or the journalists? Maybe see if there is a problem, address the problem, right? If you, last year, a very popular TV channel, they had a TV host said, allowed Mahindananda Alutgamage to say that, Muslims are the reason for increasing the number of COVID cases, right? Then what happened? And at that time, the TV host, it was a recording, supposedly, I don't know. But the TV host said, Mata tagak dendone make a kiyanawata. Kiyana dunnata. So what happens then? Where is your ethics? This is not the journalism. This is you're basically pouring more kerosene into fire because there is already so much of mistrust among communities. So stand up for what's right. I mean, sometimes you can be a single voice. In an entire newsroom, when you decide to be a journalist, you are there to tell the story, to inform the public, not to be the judge and the jury. So if you think your editor is wrong, speak to him. There were times I've worked with very, very senior editors, and I've been able to approach them and say, I don't think we should be writing it in this way. I think we should be writing it in this way. Because they always say, you have to have both stories. If the opposition is accusing the government of something, give 80% of the space for that part. But at least 20% should be for the government to comment and defend themselves or say this is wrong or whatever. But it's all about telling the story, informing the story. But here what has happened is journalism has become like we are the courts now. We have already decided to implicate, I mean, to find someone being guilty. So my point is, I cannot defend somebody who will not stand up for what's right. So you have a responsibility as a journalist, as someone who is supposed to inform the public, as being the voice of the public, to stand up for what's right. Because if you're not going to stand up for what's right within your newsroom, how are you going to stand up for anyone else? And I especially think senior journalists, forget about the cub reporters, forget about the juniors, the senior journalists, they seem to be only worrying about their byline now. I love my byline 21 years later. I still get excited when I see my byline. But if you take certain newspapers, even the English papers, certain stories, I mean, it's so much of racism. And then you have the same people, you get senior journalists in that newspaper who don't talk about it. So where do you draw your line? It is your newspaper. It is not their newspaper. Because when you go somewhere, you say, I am a journalist from this place. So it's very difficult for me to say I can defend someone. But while I understand that there is issues in relation to job security, sometimes people are not journalists may be not confident enough to, have an argument or fight with their editor or news editor. You have to also make the effort. If you just sit down and say, I can't do this, they should be able, there are seniors more than me, then it's never going to change, right? The people who send you the stories, I mean, I have had people from other newspapers sending me links and saying, I can't comment about this because it's my paper, can you do something? So, I mean, it's that situation. So I understand some of them are juniors, some of them can't, like, fight it out with their editor. But at what point do you stand up for what's right? You have to at least make an effort.
Yeah. Thank you, Munza. And I think, later on, Amantha, I also want to think about, I'm going to come to you towards the end to ask what advice you would give younger journalists today for both of you. But, I just want to take off from what Munza said. Munza seems to be suggesting that, we need to be internally motivated. Our value systems needs to be in place. We have to know what's right. We have to stand up for what's right, be willing to do that. And that suggests that, you are asking for strong internal motivation, right? However, I think Amantha talked about the low pay, the, lack of career progression. And I think there is this question of, is there some kind of, and also that the traditions of journalism have eroded already. So there aren't seniors who are kind of guiding the way, right? So it's, you hear this said now today, even with regard to the Attorney General's department, etc. People say, look, with each passing, change, the traditions have eroded of independence, of standing up to political pressures. So in that context, Amantha, is there a way to kind of reset external incentives? And I think we have to think constructively, because just simply cursing the darkness doesn't solve the problem, and which is why I would say ethics I divide. These may only be candles, but we have to light a candle and get moving. But what are to what extent does social media, consumer groups, society itself, how do we reconstruct positive incentives for better journalism? Given the context is what it is there some thoughts that you might have on that front?
So Nishan, like I said, I've never had an issue with talent in Sri Lankan journalism. I mean, after so many years, I always say I worked with a giant, and I worked and I walked hand in hand with a giant of Sri Lankan media, Lasantha, and he was a biased editor. But one thing that I respected and why I continued to work with him was that I knew his biases. And he never imposed his biases on me. He allowed me to be who I was as a journalist as long as I brought the stories that mattered and I did my job well. And the incentive for me was to become a better journalist. And knowingly or unknowingly, he put me on the path to enhance my skills. He was the one who got me onto the first fellowship. He was the one who got me onto the first university stint. So I don't know whether he did this knowingly, but he started that. So if I were to kind of bring myself as an example, I think organizations like yours who have the resources and the facilities to at least infuse some skills should invest on journalists, not journalism agencies or institutes, because we've tried that and that model has not worked in Sri Lanka. You know, we've tried to kind of change the Daily Mirror from inside. It hasn't worked. We tried to change the Observer from inside. It hasn't worked. So, but if we keep investing in good journalists, the talent that comes in, but that talent that potentially runs the risk of being disenchanted, being low paid and going elsewhere or poached by other industries, invest in that, right? Investigative stories, all that. I mean, this model of public service journalism, where you pay journalism because it does a public service. And that model probably has a chance in Sri Lanka to at least have a workable solution there. But you need to invest in individual journalists and start small. Start with like, okay, bring us a story pitch or bring us a story idea and we will invest in that. And earlier, say 10 years back, the problem would be you could invest in the story production, but where the hell are you going to put it out? Because you will again get caught to the massive industry, the Kabbalah. That's the journalism ownership houses and families. Now you can break that. You know, you have individual Facebook pages that have thousands of followers. So use that model. And I would probably also warn not to look at Sri Lankan YouTube shock jocks as the model to follow. That's out and out, you know, semi-porn gossip clickbait. That's not journalism. That is not journalism. That is just somebody trying to act in a bit of a extremist manner, be it either angry or happy or sad or absolutely ignorant just to get the clicks. Look at another model.
Thank you very much. And so I think this idea of a para newsroom, right? You take existing journalists and give them a space to be journalists and to cultivate skills and better writing outside of their organization even. And I thank you for suggesting to invest in journalists. It's something we are really keen to do. And we are trying to figure out a way to actually work directly and do exactly what you talked about in working with journalists directly and helping them grow and kind of put stuff out, right, in the way that you're talking about. So, Munza, do you have any thoughts on, you know, the kind of external incentives that may get created? I mean, apart from your own value system, was there something else that motivated you, that came from your structure, came from society? How would you see the possibility of, or is it too late? And, you know, the other thing I want to ask is this sort of a trend globally? Is this only a Sri Lankan problem? That the traditions and sort of integrity of news and journalism is declining, and by complaining about it, are we really on the wrong side of history, right? Is this going to change, and can Sri Lanka change? So really, you know, how do you see the future? Plus, how was your past? What made you different in this way, from outside, not just from inside, right?
I think when I started journalism, of course, there was a war at that time, but if you really look at it, we had a newsroom. I started at the Daily Mirror, and we had a newsroom. It comprised of everyone. I mean, Sinhalese, Buddhists, Buddhists, Muslims, Tamils, everyone. If there was a bomb blast, we didn't have that mindset where we would blame the Tamils, the Tamil journalists. Unfortunately, if you take after what happened during the Easter attacks, when the Easter attacks happened, I don't know, is it because we have more access to information now, but everyone, basically a considerable amount of people, blame the entire community, right? They wanted us to basically apologize on behalf of the terrorists, whereas, I mean, that didn't make any sense because they were terrorists. There is a reason we call them terrorists. I believe with social media and access to more information, it has come to a point where we also now understand there are more people. There are actually people called closet racists, right? And that closet racism is something that we never realized perhaps 2 decades back. But after the war was over and with the whole anti-Muslim attacks happening, I watched how a lot of people whom I thought my friends, my school friends, how they used to be very unempathetic, how they would not think twice and would share posts which basically would hurt me as a Muslim, and these are all unsubstantial posts. But if you really look at what's happening in India, and if you look at what's happening in Sri Lanka up until maybe 2019 or so, there is a very similar, we seem to be following that trend, where newspapers, the government, is basically penalizing the minorities to keep another group happy. If you look at up until 2019, we used to constantly see newspaper articles about the whole Bandapeti and so on and so forth. It's been like about 2 years and I haven't seen anything in the past 2 years. What happened to them? Did it just basically disappear? Why are we not asking these questions? Because newspapers which continuously reported on this, which continuously was also part of a problem because there was no substantial evidence again, but they reported as if there was evidence. But today, nobody seems to be talking. I understand we have a pandemic, but that doesn't mean we have to stop reporting about things like this. Why did we suddenly stop reporting about this Vadapeti? What happened to it? How did it stop at once? So it's a very complicated situation if you look at it in a journalism sense, because you get different groups right now. You get people who are anti-minorities, then you get the Tamil media, sometimes they have their own slant. The English media seems more confused about certain things, but they also tend to, sometimes certain papers have their own little racist leaning. So I think we need a proper independent body by journalists for journalists. Absolutely zero participation or involvement of the state, where we can all maybe join hands and take this forward and continue to perhaps look at producing quality journalism. Because that should be a fundamental, our ultimate goal should be to produce quality journalism. It shouldn't be reporting a story based on whether the drug addict was a Muslim, whether the rapist was a Tamil. It should be what they did was wrong, it's criminal, they have to be punished for that. So I'm thinking at some point, if I take the past 20 years that I've been a journalist, the first 10 years, I didn't see this level of racism. Even in the Sinhala media, it was far less. But with a lot of new papers, I think we should also ask, why are these papers reporting in this way? And is it because we have a society which enjoys reading this? Because the more racist the papers tend to be, the higher the circulation is also. The same thing applies to TV. So, I mean, I understand the media has a responsibility, but are they basically providing what the reader likes to read?
Yeah.
And
so you're saying the external incentives are still quite unhelpful because society
very
itself is
unhelpful.
polarized.
Yes.
And polarized reporting tends to get more traction, which
Yes.
then drives editorial interest, ownership interest,
course.
commercial interest, and that feeds back into the space for journalists to act differently. That is of course a rather let's say a non-optimistic view of the situation, I would say. So I know the time is catching up with us. Shall we kind of circle back to Amantha perhaps with the last question? I think Munza has very helpfully brought us back into the particular problem we want to talk today, Amantha, which is the polarization, which is the divide. And the social divide. So there are lots of problems in journalism that we want to talk about or should talk about. But today we are really focused on the divide, the ethnic divide, especially that is being highlighted in two fundamental ways by negative profiling of minority ethnic and religious groups. And also by a divergent discourse that's happening in the two different language media, where the, in the first case the empathy is being undermined, and the second case even public reasoning and understanding is undermined, which is creating a sort of crisis for media in terms of its democratic function. But coming back to polarization itself, is there a more targeted way that you'd look at reversing that problem? And I promise to ask you this question: what advice would you give young journalists today? In sort of, and that's how I'd want you to end. And then I'll go to Munza and ask the same question: a parting word of advice to younger journalists that you'd like to give. So over to you, Amantha, to answer that question and perhaps end with a parting word of advice here.
Yeah, I think practically to look at like possible immediate steps that you can take in terms of at least highlighting this trend. I think it's precisely that what you're doing, that not only highlighting that these issues are there in Sri Lanka, but also quantifying them and kind of creating that repository of evidence that this is not an anecdotal thing that we talk about. This is not what Nishan Dimel thought about today when he was coming to work. No, this has been happening. This is researched, and this is what is happening. So that will be like a bank that you can go back to and refer and say, this is the problem and this is what's happening. And you can use that to show the young talent that you are working with that this is what's happening in media and this is the result. Maybe not directly, but at least indirectly, this is what this kind of reporting is doing. It probably needs a little bit of refinement, but I think you can get there and then kind of use it as a repository of knowledge that you can have and journalists can have, and also others who are interested in journalism, and not only journalism, but the democracy in our country can have access to. And before I go to that final question you asked me, one more thing that I wanted to say, I think this divided society that we are talking about, I'm not sure whether it's more divided than before. I think what's happening now is that there are more outlets for those divisions to come out. And I'm talking about social media, the digital sphere, where your exposure to divisions, your exposure to those silos, those bubbles that think alike, that talk alike, are really out there, and you can easily get kind of linked into that. So we need to really look at that as well. But that's a different conversation that we need to have. In terms of what I would tell someone who's joining journalism today, you really need to feel for that storytelling ideal to become a journalist. At the end of the day, we are storytellers. We're nothing less, nothing more. We tell stories, but our stories are derived from others. So we have the privilege of listening to others tell their most important stories and telling it back to a wide audience. And now that's a privilege. So you need that if you're going to come into this. But invest in your skills. If your organization doesn't recognize that, if your community doesn't recognize that in country, that really doesn't matter. If you invest in your skills, then you can really progress. Then you can really become something by combining the talent, the flair with the kind of skills that you need. And there are so many opportunities out there that you can do that. Just because there aren't in-country opportunities, that doesn't mean that you can't gain that. I mean, I have so many of my colleagues who have gone outside of the country to gain the kind of exposure, the kind of skills that they need, and that will enhance their repertoire. And Sri Lankan journalists are still recognized outside of the country. Some are not, but they are still recognized as committed, as talented, and at least a minority who actually walk the talk that they talk. So you still have that. So if you want to go far in this career, if you want to, like Munza has said, 2 decades down the road to turn back and say, I'm still a writer, just don't keep writing in a Sri Lankan news organization and follow whoever is, next up the ladder of the salary. Try to look at new skills. Try to think of yourself as, the new normal journalist. We talk about new normal, right? So what's the new normal journalism? What's the new normal newsroom? I mean, like my work in the last 2 years and ongoing is about what is tomorrow's newsroom? Is it going to be in my room? I mean, I'm working in my room. I haven't gone out of this room to work for 13 months now. Is it the newsroom? Now, but you need skills to do this. You need technical, you need pragmatic, and you need other skills. And I think invest in those. And again, thank you very much. And I hope I was useful in that small way. And good luck with everything that you're doing.
Thank you, Amantha. I'm going to come to Munza for the last word, but to note, you sort of highlighted a very important external incentives that journalists who maintain their integrity and the kind of larger purpose and value of journalism tend to succeed internationally, though they start in Sri Lanka. And actually, my friends have gone on to be heads of Reuters for Asia, for Reuters for Americas, heading, say, the Newsweek group in journalism, working for international publications. And many journalists, actually, while in Sri Lanka, I know, are working for international publications because they've kind of shown that they are better than others. And perhaps that's a very important incentive, that if you do better, you may not get rewarded in your own organization, but there'll be global recognition for you. Munza, your last word of advice, but Amantha.
I want to add one thing. And journalism is now not only working for the news outlet. There are so many opportunities. Don't kind of think of yourself as reporting the news. There is so much more out there now that you can be something that we didn't even think about, just last year, I guess. So sorry for that intervention. I just wanted to kind of put it out there.
There was, in fact, a question that said, is the contract with the owner or with society? And so what you're saying is, of course, it's both, but that social contract has enormous opportunity, I think, is what I hear you saying, and to actively think about your social contract also, while thinking about your employment contract separately. So thank you for that, Amantha. Munza, you want to share some advice as a closing thought, after which we'll bring this to the end?
Yeah, so if I am to say one thing to anyone who is planning on becoming a journalist, who is interested to join journalism in Sri Lanka, to join a local newsroom, don't do it if you want to earn money because the pay is so bad. But as you keep working here, if you are consistent, if you are good at reporting, if you are good at producing quality work, you will be approached by many from overseas. I'm not saying I'm the best, but I have been approached from Los Angeles Times. I have been approached by Nikkei. I never approached them. They wrote to me and wanted me to write. So while I was working at a newsroom, I also freelanced overseas. So you should be able to understand your passion, because when you're working for an overseas organization, what you can report is different compared to when you're working for a local newspaper. But sometimes it has to also go hand in hand, because you also need the finance. I mean, you also need the money at the end of the day. But another thing, maintain your integrity, your ethics. At the end of the day, that's what matters. Because you can have any amount of money, but if you have a record, as in where your integrity, your ethics as a journalist is questioned, I think you kind of have lost to a certain point. So yeah, those are two things I would like to highlight, but I would like to maybe tell Verité, maybe start a program, involve the editors, involve the news editors, the journalists, continuously, regularly, you know, in a way where you all can highlight, say, this is what is being happening in newsrooms, how it's been reported, not just newsrooms, television stations. This is wrong. This is not what journalism is. I'm sure many of them will decline your invitation, but please keep trying, because we have to come to a point where we have to move beyond where we are right now. And right now, journalism is a little at the lowest in Sri Lanka compared to what it was. Very few papers I see which has quality journalism, at least decent journalism. So I think you all can play a bigger role. And something that's been done regularly, not a one-off thing, because here what happens is they're going to do it one-off, everyone forgets it after about a month. So yeah.
Thank you for that encouragement. We really do want to do what you're saying and been looking for ways to kind of make that happen. So I know we've gone about 12 minutes over time, so I won't hold us further except to just thank everyone who's here and stayed with us. Thank all the presenters, Nirandi, Stephanie, Rochelle, Deepanjali for kind of running the whole show, I think. And Amantha, Munza, special thanks to you. I think we have consulted you all at different points for advice, and you've often been very supportive and helpful. I think we value that enormously. And I think, we want to encourage all of you who are here today to keep being aware of the way in which the media that we consume is contributing to polarizing and, in effect, poisoning the empathetic process and the reasoning process in our society. And I think we can all be educators of our families, of our neighbors, of our friends, by picking up a piece of news and saying, this shouldn't be the way it is reported. And I think we also believe in educating the consumer, because sometimes, if people are producing food that is bad for you, the only solution is sometimes to educate the consumer to be more discerning. And I think discerning consumers can also help in changing the dynamics and the incentives for media. And we can all use the content, I think, in Ethics, in Divide, but we don't need the platforms. We can spot it ourselves, right? These are fairly obvious. But looking at these platforms will kind of sensitize you to examples that when you spot it, you talk about it and talk about why that's wrong, and be a person that is helping to change the consumer. And I think it is deeply worrying for us, the way in which we may, as a society, may be getting shaped by the polarizing tendencies of media. And I want to encourage all of us who are here today to be part of that change, of reversing that. And thank you very much for being here. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, guys.